coming in and out.
No, I'm okay. Just hang on.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, good morning and welcome to America's Web Radio. And, one thing that we didn't do and we just got to do in honor of General Dix, and let's just do it, and everybody will appreciate this.
Put them down. Put them down. Stay in step. Stay in step. Sounding good. Sounding good. Listen up. Listen up. Got to learn. Got to learn. New cadence. New cadence. Here we go. You can do it. You can do it.
Okay, everybody that's been in the military knows exactly what that's all about. That's the cadence, and we never went anywhere on post that or on the fort that if you were in your platoon or whatever and double timing or just marching from one building to the next, you had a cadence, and you had the first sergeant or your platoon leader leading that cadence. And I tell you what, in Fort Ord, California, cadence calls have gotten me through some really sandy areas of marching. So we always start off in, generally speaking, on Mondays with our own General Dix, and doing the show Remembering Desert Shield and Desert Storm. General Dix does the cadence call, and we hope that he's back off of his pandemic duty very shortly. He's been helping our government with logistics, and he is well recognized as an expert in logistics. That was part of what he did in Desert Shield and Desert Storm. So we always put a shout out to our favorite General Richard Dix. So with that being said, let me introduce our guest today. We've got a great guest, and when I first heard the name of the group that her father was in, I immediately remembered the movie that I'd watched about Merrill's Marauders. And Merrill's Marauders made their name in Korea, and we've got the daughter of one of the Marauders on right now, and that's Jonnie Clasen. Is it Clasen or Clausen?
It's Clasen.
Pardon?
Clasen, C-L-A-S-E-N.
Okay.
I'm not a pickle.
Okay, well...
I always get called Clasen, David.
Okay, well, anyway, we've got Jonnie on, and I'm going to turn it over to her and talk about her father and the fact that he was inducted into the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame, and Rick White, who is the director, Colonel Rick White. Whoops, wait a second.
You'll love it, and you'll love having one. And
that's because the dummy on the board forgot to go to manual and stayed in queue, and there came a voice from out of the board. Anyway, we're back with Jonnie, and she's going to tell us about how her father got inducted, and also talk about what she has been doing. And she has led a very, very interesting life, from correspondent up and down the gambit of things. So, Jonnie, I'm going to just sort of turn it over to you, and every now and then I'll jump in and ask a question, and I hope it'll be a very meaningful question. But you're a writer, a photographer. You've won multiple awards, and have a very interesting father that you all shared a lot of time together, and a lot of folks, and this, I get real upset, as does Richard Dix and a lot of the folks that do shows here, that our school system, in many cases, and our particularly even as we get into higher levels of education, and I consider that starting in high school, but then when we go and take an American history course or whatever course it happens to be in college, that our teachers and our books are not giving the value and the justice to the history of the military and different groups like Merrill's Marauders. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jonnie, and talk. I hope you're going to talk about some of the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame, and then also talk about your father and Merrill's Marauders. So it's all yours.
Okay, David, thank you, and thank you to Rick White and to Paul Longrear, who was involved in starting the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. And my dad was Vincent Morello, and Daddy was Merrill's Marauder. He was the last living Merrill's Marauder in Georgia, and he was also a Korean War veteran. He was in Korea before the war, during the war, and after the war. And excuse me. Dad was an inaugural inductee into the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. That was the first year, and that was in 2013, I believe. And also during that year, earlier, Paul Longrear had nominated Daddy for the Ranger Hall of Fame at Fort Benning, and he was inducted into that, and Paul and Daddy ironically have the same birthday, but it's in different decades. And Merrill's Marauders were a top secret commando unit in the China-Burma India Theater, which today is called the Forgotten Theater of World War II. Most people are not even aware that it existed. And the Marauders, who are Rangers today, were not Rangers during World War II. They were formed, actually, by in 1943, Winston Churchill and FDR, President Roosevelt, got together in Canada at the Quebec Conference, and they decided that they needed to open up supply lines in Burma so that supplies could get through to China, because the only way to get those supplies over there was like over the hump, over the Himalayas. And so there needed to be a land route. And the British, the Chindits, had been in Burma and had been forced out of Burma. And so FDR and Winston Churchill formed, they said that there should be 3 battalions who were top secret, who would fight completely behind enemy lines. And they asked for volunteers in 1943 for a, quote, dangerous and hazardous mission. It was actually a suicide mission because they were expecting more than 85% casualties. A lot of the men didn't know that. And my dad came out of Panama and Trinidad, and there were 3 battalions, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And the 2nd battalion was almost totally from men that came from the Caribbean. And then the 1st and the 3rd battalions came from the United States and from people in the South Pacific. But before I go any further, I was very interested in what you said about the cadences, because when I was growing up, I learned those because Daddy sang them around the house. And you may have heard this one, David. You had a good home and you left your right, so what do? You fight. Sound off. 1, 2, hit it again. 3, 4, letter it out. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Very good. I should have let you start the show.
Daddy was full of little things like that. But my dad was on the patrol where the first Merrill's Marauder, Private Landis, was killed. Well, I guess I should back up. The battalions from Panama and from the United States traveled in secret cross-country to Camp Stoneman, California, which was a holding area before they shipped out. And they left on a ship called the Lurline, which was a luxury liner. And they had no idea where they were going. They didn't have a name. My dad thought they might be going to South Africa. And they didn't know where they were going, but there was one marauder, Bob Passanisi, who's 95. He's the second youngest living marauder. There are 9 left alive right now.
Wow.
Bob lives in New York, and his MOS was communications. So after they got on the ship, something happened with their communication system, and the captain asked Bob if he could fix it. And he did. So the captain gave Bob some special privileges, like a better place to stay, and he assigned him to do a radio show called every night for the men aboard ship, who had no idea where they were going. And Bob accidentally found out where they were going, so he ended the radio show with the Song of India every night, hoping the men would get an idea where they were going, because that was their destination. The ship landed in Bombay,
Joni,
and
let me ask.
and they didn't have a name, and they were a British unit, which is kind of unusual. They were American volunteers under command of Lord Louis Mountbatten, and they were trained by General Ord Wingate's Chindits in jungle warfare. And then they were part of the Southeast Asia Command, and General Stilwell had the China-Burma-India Theater, and he wasn't very happy that there were American volunteers serving under a British unit, so he did whatever finagling they do, and the men were transferred to the CBI, China-Burma-India Theater. So in early 1944, they were given the name the 5307th Composite Unit Provisional. And their commander at that time, General Frank D. Merrill, was assigned to be their commander. When they were trained by the British, Colonel Charles Hunter was their commander, and Colonel Hunter, Stilwell, and Merrill were all West Point graduates. And Colonel Hunter actually was their longest-serving commander, because General Merrill had a heart attack right before they achieved their mission, which was to capture an all-weather airfield in northern Burma. It was the Michinau airfield. And that would open up supply lines so that planes could be flown in to connect. There were 2 roads, the Lido Road and the Burma Road. And so when supplies were able to be flown in, it would enable a pathway to be forged into China, which, as I mentioned earlier, was our ally.
Joni, we're going to have to take a break. If you got to really sort of listen up when I'm breaking in. Also, while we're gone on break, when we come back, I'd like to ask you a question on, did they have any special training? Like, if you go into, first when I was in, Green Berets, or then Special Forces, and the different units that we have today, did they give the Marauders, before they were to go into their landing zone, did they give them any special training? We'll be back
yes,
on America's...
that's what General Ward Wingate did.
We'll be back on America's Web Radio right after this break.
In a 71 Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser,
Joni,
into classic cars with Steve
can you not hear me?
and Jim Weber. Every Saturday
Yes,
from 8 to 9
it's kind of hard,
America's
David,
Web
but I
Radio.
can't hear you.
Okay, well, you're gonna. Okay, we'll take another break at the half hour,
Uh-huh.
basically, and so you're gonna really need to sort of listen up for me coming in. Okay.
Okay, how am I doing?
You're doing great. And I was trying to ask your question, and you weren't listening. But I was
I
trying to
can't
ask
hear you real well. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
I was
I'll
trying.
try to pause more, David.
We don't have to pause more. Just listen for if. And I tell you what, I'll just back off, and you're doing great. You don't need me asking questions anyway. So,
No, I love your questions.
I'll. Okay, we'll be coming back in just a second. I'll come back and open it and give it back to you. Okay.
You might ask me about Dad and the 1918 flu epidemic.
Okay. Alrighty, and we're back on America's Web Radio, and our special guest today is Jonnie Clasen, and she is the daughter of one of Merrill Marauders, and I think one of the sad things is that a lot of folks don't know what we're talking about or who Merrill's Marauders were, but I remember the film, and I'm sure Jonnie will talk about that. And also she brought up the fact, too, that her father was around for the 1918 flu epidemic, which we talked a little bit about this morning on our doctor's lounge. But the big difference, and I think it's a bad difference in some ways, but the big difference between what we've got going on now and what they had going on in 1918 is the fact that we've got the media breathing down everybody's necks, throwing in their opinions. And in 1918, we had no media. We had the newspaper, and it was 2 weeks late and delivered to the wrong yard anyway. So a lot of difference in the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, and the 2020 pandemic. But anyway, let's get back to Jonnie. She's the interesting one, talking about her father and what they did with Merrill's Marauders. And oh, we gotta mention at some point, Jonnie, the Jeff Chandler movie. I love that and remember it well.
Well, David, I'll start out with the Jeff Chandler movie then. That movie is actually based on a book written by a Merrill's Marauder, who is a journalist and author from Atlanta, Georgia. That was Charlton Ogburn Jr. And he wrote the first account of the Marauder mission. And that's what led to the creation of the movie starring Jeff Chandler. And Merrill's Marauders had 14 Nisei Japanese-American interpreters, many of whom came from the internment camp, trained through the military intelligence service. And they were kind of upset with the movie because the director used Filipinos to play the Japanese rather than Japanese. But General Sam Wilson, who was a young lieutenant with Merrill's Marauders, served as a consultant to that movie starring Jeff Chandler. And General Wilson said that the movie kind of was a comedy, but the men liked it, some liked it, some didn't like it. The Nisei really didn't, most of them didn't. But, and General Wilson said that there had been an earlier movie called Objective Burma, and that movie starred Errol Flynn, and it was supposed to be about the Marauders, but the men parachuted into Burma, and Daddy and I watched it, and we thought it looked like the Marauders, but the Marauders actually walked almost 1,000 miles through the jungles and up the foothills of the Himalayas, where they came down with typhus, and many of them did, on their way to the Michinow airfield. But anyway, General Wilson said that Queen Elizabeth banned the movie for a while in Burma because it looked like the Americans completely won the war in Burma, and the British were the ones that were in there fighting first. But one thing I wanted to say about the book that was written by Charlton Ogburn, who went on to serve in the State Department after Merrill's Marauders, is what's written on the cover. And I have a copy of the book right here, and it says, "The Marauders tells the true story of 3 gallant battalions in the jungles of Burma. They were apparently forgotten, frequently lost, occasionally mutinous, and almost always magnificent." I love that because I think that really encapsulates what the men were all about. They were called everything from magnificent to misfits. They had been called the dead-end kids by some journalists, and there was a writer and a photographer, David Richardson, who wrote for Yank magazine. He was primarily a photographer and an excellent writer. He wrote for Yank magazine, and he accompanied the men on their almost 1,000-mile march, shooting both his camera and a gun. And and his stories kind of made the United States aware at that time of what was going on in Burma, because a lot of the focus was on the Pacific theater and the European theater. And Burma and also Africa, you don't hear that much, you don't hear that much about them. But what's significant about David Richardson is that a few weeks ago we were notified that he's going to be inducted into the Army Ranger Hall of Fame this year. There are about 15 Rangers who are going to be inducted, and David is one of them. And there are about 28, I believe, David, Rangers in the Army Ranger Hall of Fame right now who've been inducted.
If anybody ever, if people like history, and everybody has their own definition of what they like in history, but I have always found that there is no better story than the military history stories, and everything from Merrill's Rangers or Merrill's Marauders up and down the gambit. And the fact is, they're not novels; they're true stories, and this stuff happened, and this stuff happened to Americans, and it's always, I find it just fascinating, and I do.
Well, I agree with you, and I think I mentioned that for 15 or 16 of the past 20 years, I've been a full-time live-in caregiver to my parents. And after my mother's death in 2005, I told Daddy that we could go to any military reunions he wanted to go to. So we went to Merrill's Marauders, the 33rd Infantry, 5th Regimental Combat Team for Korea, and the Korean War Veterans, Association. And that led David to Daddy doing living history programs where he did go into the schools. And there have been some wonderful schools here in Georgia, like in LaGrange and Zebulon, where they really promote military history. And Daddy had the good fortune to set up at those annual events. LaGrange does it several times a year, where veterans from all wars, including women, go in and set up a table in the auditorium or in the hallways, in the case with Zebulon. And every student in that school walks through there. And some are more interested than others, but it's amazing. One time, I also set up Rosie the Riveter, and I set up what women did in World War One. I had a big triple board up there, and one of the young women walked by and looked at me and said, "What did you do in World War One?" So they, a lot of the students don't have they don't comprehend the time sequence. Like World War One was 1918 when you mentioned the flu epidemic. And if I have time right here, I'd like to say something about Daddy. My dad, Vincent Malello, was the fifth child of Italian immigrants. He was born in Boonton, New Jersey, and he was orphaned by the 1918 flu epidemic. His mother died when he was 3 months old, and he was placed in an orphanage by for little Italian boys in Gladstone, New Jersey, the Villa O'Connor orphanage. And then he was sent to the boys' home, and while he was there, the father he didn't know he had went to get him and took him back to a big Italian family where he didn't know anybody. And at that time, there were a total of 14 children because his dad had married a woman who lost her husband in the flu epidemic. And my dad's entire life, including the military, was forged by the 1918 flu epidemic. Daddy said that in the orphanage, meaning the Villa O'Connor, he slept in a boys' dormitory, and there was a nun in the center of the room with a tent around her bed. And in the military, he slept in a barracks, and instead of a nun, he had a first sergeant. And so, because my dad felt very comfortable in that environment, the military environment, because that's the type environment that he grew up in the orphanage. And I wanted to say something about the 1918 flu epidemic. There were 500 million people affected worldwide, and 50 million died. And I think more people died during the 1918 flu epidemic than were killed during World War I. And it was horrible, like you said, because there wasn't the media attention. And in fact, I think a lot of people weren't aware of how awful it was until the coronavirus pandemic became apparent. My dad, getting back to my dad was Italian, and he said that there were so many Italians in Merrill's Marauders, like Passanisi, Malello, Montiglio, Maganato, that instead of saying Italian fallout, you could say Italians fallout. But there were actually, something just clicked. There were actually 15 ethnic groups in Merrill's Marauders. And the oldest Merrill's Marauder was a World War I veteran. His name was Joe Doyer. And he had served in World War I with the Canadian Black Watch Highlanders. And keep in mind, all of these men were volunteers. Many of them volunteered from the South Pacific. And some of them, like the men today who go through war, had PTSD. But men of their generation didn't talk about it. It wasn't something they talked about. And I've recently learned that some of the Marauders, including one in Texas, David, where you were, had to go through electric shock therapy.
Oh, yeah. And
he had PTSD so bad that he nailed the windows shut in his house, and it ruined his marriage.
Yeah, they, back then it was called shell shocked, or, they had different names for it.
There was shell shock, and I suppose people in all wars have had it.
Oh, yeah.
Daddy said that, after his father went to get him when he was around 10 or 11, that there was an older man, a World War I veteran, who used to...
Joni, we're going to have to stop for a break, okay?
Oh, sure, sure.
We've come up against a hard break. We'll be back with Joni right after this.
If your health insurance premium is more than your mortgage, Ellen Deal with Ideal Solutions is here to help. Whether you're a small business owner, individual, family, or baby boomer, email maga45cag@gmail.com and I'll respond with 3 easy questions to help you determine if you can get away from Obamacare. As a 20-year veteran of the insurance industry, I'm here to help with all your insurance needs. Email Ellen Deal at maga45cag@gmail.com.
See, this isn't so hard, is it?
No, it's not, It's just that, you know what my ex-husband said, David? He said I have right-angle thinking, which you probably hear when I'm talking. But I go down one path and then shoot off in another.
Oh, well, no, you're doing fine. You're doing super.
Okay.
So we'll be coming back shortly. Okay?
Thank you.
Talking to you about antique car insurance. In this hobby that I've been part of for years, not all insurance companies and insurance coverage is the same. I would suggest that you call J.C. Taylor or visit jctaylor.com to find out some information about some of the best antique car insurance you can get, such as agreed value insurance for your classic car. Again, when you get ready to insure your classic, antique, or even your street rod, call J.C. Taylor Insurance or visit jctaylor.com.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
And we're back on America's Web Radio with David Spick. And basically, the show is brought to you by the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. And I want to tip my hat, as always, to Rick White. He's the executive director, and he does a fantastic job. And if you're in Atlanta, Georgia, and you've never been to the Hall of Fame, it's in the old Sloppy Floyd building right across the street from the state capitol. The state capitol, for you that don't know it, is the one that has the gold dome on it, and it's real gold. And if you get up there scraping it off, they'll shoot you. No, I don't know about that. But anyway, it is a gold dome, and the Veterans Hall of Fame is right across the street, and they have a very good cafeteria there, as a matter of fact, so you and the family can go through, look, and visit with maybe family members that have served in the past, and read all about them, and then go have a good meal and finish your tour. So it's the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame, and Georgia is blessed in that, by the way, there are a lot of other states that are building or starting their own Hall of Fames because they realize how important Georgia's is and what it's done for the state and for honoring our veterans. And we always, at America's Web Radio, we honor our veterans and the job that they've done. And it doesn't matter what branch, what anything, if they're a veteran, they served. And for you that haven't served, when we were doing the cadence calls, you can't appreciate how much that means to a veteran. And they hear different ones, and just like Jonnie pointed out, her father had obviously sung cadence calls in their home, and she remembered them, and I think that was beautiful. So we appreciate you listening in, and we'll always, if you'd like to advertise in this show, you're more than welcome to contact General Manager, GM, at americaswebradio.com, and tell folks that you're open. How are they going to know with the pandemic if you're open or closed? So let them know across, not only in Georgia and Atlanta, but we're listened to around the world, and we're touching people all over the world constantly. And if you do business in Australia or the UK, or it doesn't matter where, people are listening, and you need to talk to us and let people know that you're wide open for business, and you'll take it and mail it out to them, and you'll sanitize the box before you send it. Anyway, thank you for listening, and let's get back to Jonnie and her tales and stories about. Jonnie, I got to ask one question. I always ask, I guess, one question. And obviously your dad was proof positive of this, but have you ever known a veteran that only had one story to tell?
No. But one thing I've noticed, like with the Marauders, a lot of them didn't start talking. My dad didn't. I grew up with it. And I mean, I didn't grow up with the Marauders. I grew up knowing my dad was a soldier, but I didn't realize until I was an adult the significance of what Merrill's Marauders did. And my dad really didn't start telling those stories that you're talking about, David, until he was in his 60s. Mm-hmm. And I think that's common with some of the men from that generation. And then for others, like we were talking about PTSD, it was so horrible they didn't want to talk about it.
Well, this is one thing that we've been very fortunate about. I don't take I am a veteran. At least people call me a veteran, and I sometimes take a little bit of issue with them in that they have now tagged us as Vietnam era veterans, and that means that I didn't serve in country, and I don't ever claim that I served in country. But I did serve for 6 years, and I was in the reserves. And we take the same oath that everybody else took. And I'm very fortunate with all of my veteran friends that they accept us or accept me and accept all ARs and NGs now as veterans and Vietnam veteran eras. And even the VA is beginning to accept us, which is a nice change. But, you know, everybody serves at their own. And I love the fact that we have a volunteer military now. And it's great. My son's serving in Germany. And I love our country and I love our military. And we'll do everything we can to support it. So, back to Merrill's Marauders and Jonnie.
Thank you, David. And I wanted to say something about the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. After Daddy was inducted, he nominated Dr. Carlton Savory, who was called the Ranger Doctor. He was an orthopedic doctor here in Columbus, and now plans like the lecture series at the National Infantry Museum. And Dr. Savory, the committee did accept him into the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. And this year, there are a couple of people that I would like to, I'm trying to get their families to submit applications. And one of them is Eleanor Stark's husband, Luther Buck Bagley. When the Marauders reached their objective, which was the Michinow airfield, there were only, out of the 3,000 men, almost 3,000, there were only a few hundred, several hundred, who were capable of fighting. Along with the Japanese, they fought 5 major battles and 30 minor engagements. The superior Japanese 18th Division, that's who they were fighting against. And their numbers had been decimated not only by the Japanese, but also and largely by all the jungle maladies, malaria, Mike typhus, dysentery. It was pretty horrible. The men that struggled into the Michinow airfield were described as walking skeletons. And that was when they secured the airfield. That was supposed to be the end of their mission. But when they secured the airfield, almost immediately 2,500 replacements started flying in. And many of the replacements were not combat trained. They'd been taken out of all sorts of places, and the planes were just kind of taxiing, and the men were jumping out onto the ground. And later, in many instances, while there was a battle going on, and one of those replacements was Luther Buck Bagley, who was the husband of Eleanor Stark, who lives in Pembroke, Georgia. and he was killed in July 1944. And Eleanor has been waiting for, this will be the 76 years, for his remains to come home because he is still MIA. And she got the message that her husband had been killed when she was working as Rosie the Riveter in Savannah for Southeast Shipping. And last fall, another one of those replacements to the 5307, I think his name was Hewlett, and he was from Carrollton, Georgia. His remains were returned home. And that reminds me, there is a living replacement in the Atlanta area, Stanley Sassine. And Stanley is one of those 2,500 men who were flown into Burma. And when Stanley was in his 90s, he jumped out of an airplane, which I think is, it shows you how tough some of these men really are.
Oh yeah.
One thing I want to say is I started in 2016 when the Merrill's Marauders Association was inactive, and an association was formed by the children, people like me, so that our fathers could just go and enjoy themselves. Well, that went inactive in 2016, and we didn't have records of exactly how many Merrill's Marauders were alive. So Bob Passanisi, who I mentioned earlier, who's currently the spokesperson and historian for Merrill's Marauders, sent me a bunch of lists, which took me 3 months to go through, and I determined there were 28 alive, and I still missed a few. And today, I started sending little care packages to them. I did it for Veterans Day of that year to let them know that that the association had gone inactive. And David, I only planned to send that package out once. I had gone around to all the Ranger units at Fort Benning, and they gave me T-shirts and things, that I could include in the packages, and it was to be a one-time deal. And then I started getting thank you letters from these men all over the country and saying, we didn't think anybody cared about us anymore. We thought we were forgotten. And one of the letters I received was from, I think he was 101 or a year-old Nisai. He was the last Japanese-American interpreter, Tom Sabuta, in Hawaii.
Wow.
And he wrote it, a little handwritten note. And I thought, okay, I looked up and said, okay, Dad, I'm going to be doing this, for the long haul. And what's significant about Tom Sabuta is that he was educated in Japan, Japanese American. He was with the National Guard on December 7th when Pearl Harbor was bombed. He was on maneuvers.
Wow.
And all the men in his unit thought the firing initially was part of their maneuvers, and they very quickly learned that it wasn't. And on December the 8th, Tom, because of his language skills, there was a half-naked man walking down the road looking dazed, and he was Japanese-American, and Tom interrogated him, and it turns out he was the first prisoner of war in World War II, and he was the only survivor of the two-man mini submarines that had tried to reach land.
Wow, yeah.
And, you can Google Tom. His last name is Tsubota. But at that time, he probably wasn't given the recognition that he needed, or maybe he didn't need recognition, but he wasn't recognized that much because we had just been bombed the day before by the Japanese. But there's an independent filmmaker, Stacy Hayashi, several years ago. She created an independent film movie called Go for Broke, which highlighted all of the the men from the MIS, the Japanese Americans, and their role in World War II, which is another amazing story.
Oh, absolutely.
And when
Jonnie, we need to break in here, and
I try to have
Jonnie, we need to break in here and just give a plug to the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame, as well as run a couple of ads. And you're listening to David's Pick on America's Web Radio, which we always pick, or basically always pick, someone involved with the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame. And Jonnie's father was in Merrill Marauders, and invite everybody, if you haven't seen the movie, go and check out the movie. If you like war stories, war movies, back in World War II, it's a great movie. In fact, I'm going to watch it this weekend. It's been a while since I've watched it, and I want to do that. So I want to thank Jonnie, and we'll be back with her in just a minute to wrap up the last segment. We'll have about 13 minutes in the last segment. We'll be back right after this.
Perhaps you are struggling to cope with the disease of addiction. If not, you probably know a family member or friend that needs help in battling the cravings and the personal and professional damage done by the effects of drugs or alcohol. Get a pen and paper and be ready to write down the following. These are the issues that the trained staff at the Atlanta Healing Center address and treat every day. Their doctors and counselors with over 40 years of practice in the field of addiction can treat the suffering individual in a thoughtful, compassionate, and experienced manner and guide him or her along the path to recovery. So call 770-696-9862 and speak to a knowledgeable staff member about how you or your loved one can be helped to enjoy a better and healthier life. More information is also available on the website at www.atlantahealingcenter.com.
If your health insurance premium is more than your mortgage, Ellen Deal with Ideal Solutions is here to help. Whether you're a small business owner, individual, family, or baby boomer, email MAGA45CAG@gmail.com, and I'll respond with 3 easy questions to help you determine if you can get away from Obamacare. As a 20-year veteran of the insurance industry, I'm here to help with all your insurance needs. Email Ellen Deal at MAGA45CAG@gmail.com.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
And we're back on America's Web Radio, and our last segment with Jonnie, and her father was...
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the America's Broadcast Network.
That wasn't supposed to happen. How did that happen? Anyway, we're back with Jonnie, and we're going to be talking in the last segment, about 10 minutes more on Merrill's Marauders. And I guess, Jonnie, if there's one thing you would like to leave the audience with about your father and about Merrill's Marauders, what would be that one point to stick in everybody's mind about, and I think we look at our government as Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but in all wars, there are people that have fought behind the lines. There have been spies in all wars, and just because we're the United States doesn't mean that we haven't used folks to gather information. And if you're going to win the war, and that's what you go, if you're in there, that's what you're there for, is to win, and you do it any way you can. And I think, if I remember the movie correctly, there was almost a statement by Chandler about, well, we'll do anything we have to win this battle, or whatever it was. But anyway, so you know more about it than I do. What's your one thing that you would like to leave behind about the Marauders?
I suppose what I'd like to leave behind was these men accomplished something that had been called impossible. They weren't expected to survive at all, but they did. Some did, quite a few did. In fact, 5 lived into their hundreds. And I would say it's just their resilience. Almost every man says there was no way out. They were going through the jungle behind enemy enemy lines. They had to hack their way through. They had no mechanized vehicles. All they had were mules, and so they had to cut openings in the jungle through really thick bamboo, not the thin kind that we have here in Georgia. And they had to make like a tunnel for the men and the mules to pass through. And what they accomplished was like I said, it was termed impossible. But they did it. And they did it. They say they did it by putting one foot in front of the other. They were the infantry. And one thing I want to say is that when I determined how many were alive, there were 28 in 2016. Today we have 9 alive. And something that's really significant is that we're trying to get the Congressional Gold Medal for this unit. And Senator Jonnie Clasen introduced the bill in the Senate in 2017, and we're in our third congressional 2 year. Each session is 2 years. We're in the third one trying to get this passed for the Marauders. And the bill was first introduced by the House by Congressman Peter King in New York, and the major co-sponsor was Congressman Sanford Bishop here in Georgia. So, I'm really proud that both Senator Isaacson and Sanford Bishop, got behind this effort to get the Congressional Gold Medal. In December last year, the entire Senate, we got the bill passed in the Senate, and right now we're halfway there in the House of Representatives. 2 of the surviving Merrill's Marauders, Bob Passanisi, who's 95 and lives in New York, and Gilbert Howland, who's 96 and lives in New Jersey, went to Washington, D.C., and these men in their 90s walked again. They were walking for victory, but this time it was for the Congressional Gold Medal, and they walked an average at their age of 3.5 miles a day through the halls of Congress trying to get the Congressional Gold Medal. In Georgia, 5 of the 14 representatives, congressmen and women in Georgia.
Good morning and welcome to America's Web Radio. And it's time for Agent in Charge. And we've got the Agent in Charge online. And
it can be awarded while there's some who are still alive to be honored by the Congressional Gold Medal, which is the highest honor that the United States can give a military unit. And I'd like to just mention where the rest of these men are from. James Collins is 96 years old. He lives in Tampa, Florida. Rocco DeLuca is 97. He lives in Connecticut. He's currently in lockdown in a long-term care facility. Russell Hamler is 95. Like James Collins in Florida, Russell Hamler lives in his own home. Russell is in Pennsylvania. And Lester Holenbach, we have 2 from Florida. That's the only state that has 2. Lester Holenbach is 97, and he just lost his wife last December. She was 91. And Gilbert Howland, I mentioned before. And the oldest right now is Gabriel Kinney, who's just right next door to us in Alabama. Gabriel is 99, and he lives with his wife in an apartment in a senior facility. So does Gilbert Howland. And then Raleigh Nays is 97 years old. He lives in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. He is also in a long-term care facility. But his wife, Betty, who's 92 years old, goes every day and stands outside his window holding up notes to encourage him to eat. And then over in Tennessee, above us, is James Richardson, who turns 99 in James turns 99 in July, and James and Gabriel Kinney, Bob Passanisi, and Gilbert Howland are frequently at Fort Benning to attend Ranger events. I wanted to also mention the strong connection to Dahlonega, Georgia, that Merrill's Marauders have, because Camp Frank D. Merrill, where the mountain phase of Ranger training is conducted, is named after their commander.
Oh yeah, I've been up there, run their course with my son, and they open it up on Mother's Day, as a matter of fact, and they have a nice little museum, and would certainly think anybody that has the time and can do it would love to see. And that's, once you've gone through Ranger School and you're at Benning for parachute school, and then you come up to Dahlonega and go through the Ranger School, you're a tough person after you get out of all of that. And
one thing you mentioned earlier, you asked me about the training the Marauders had. Mm-hmm. The men in the 2nd Battalion, were Daddy and Gilbert Howland, and almost the whole 2nd Battalion came from. They went through jungle training in Panama and Trinidad, but the entire 3 battalions were trained by General Ord Wingate's Chindits, who were they were the top, they were excellent jungle fighters, and so they got their jungle training from the Chindits before they set off on their long walk to capture the Michinou airfield.
Wow. This is what this show is all about, and what the radio station is about really is history. And if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. And there are many things that we don't want to repeat in our life at this point. But Joni, you've been fantastic on the show, and I hope that your family has been listening, and that others have been listening and taken note of, and will watch the movie. I suggest that to everybody, that they go in and watch the movie. What do you remember the exact name, Merrill Marauders, or what was the exact name of it? Do you remember?
I think it is Merrill's Marauders.
Okay, so they should know it, and that's great.
And you can buy it online.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, with that being said, one more time, I want to thank you for being on today, and we will, at some point, I always ask our guests, will you decide to come back on?
I would like to, if you would like me to.
Yeah, well,
maybe if I come back on, I can say the men got the Congressional Gold Medal.
Exactly, and if that does happen, will you please let me know, and we'll make sure that you do come back on. That would be great. It's I love history. I love the military. We have a couple of flags in our studio with us, and we've been very fortunate to get to know many of the guys that are in the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame, and we appreciate that. And
I hope the 2 families I'm going to contact will submit their military person.
Yes, ma'am. That would be great. Well, with that, we're going to have to, like I say, put the plug in the jug and get out of here and get ready for Healthcare Insights. And again, we thank you for being with us this morning, and we will be talking to you soon. Thank you, Joni.
Thank you, David.
Bye-bye.